Huh?
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, featuring your hosts, Taylor Field and Ruben Olson.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues, Campfire Clues. I am your host, Taylor, and today we're going to be diving into some haunted forests with some little legends and encounters attached to them. But before we get into that, a couple of plugs. You can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca, social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, and in our Patreon, where we get ad-free exclusive early episodes. And if you want to say hello, you can send us an email, cryptidclues@gmail.com. Now, if you tuned into our episode that came out earlier this week, our 50th celebration episode, me and Ruben did a little bit of fun trivia there. It was a good time. And he also indulged in a upcoming series that we're going to be doing. Now, our first episode of this new kind of arc is going to drop on all of our main feeds, of course. And then after that, we're going to have all the other ones drop only on our Patreon, though, because we're going to be diving into a special campaign that Ruben has constructed based in the real world using D&D, Dungeons and Dragons mechanics, but he's transitioned it all into a real world aspect with real places, real items, everything. And he's created this amazing campaign. I don't know anything about it because I'm going to be going into it, and we might have a couple other people join me in this excursion too, but it's going to be a very good time. But we wanted to just put the main episode out, so that'll be dropping in the future here. Maybe it could be this Monday or the next Monday. We just have to see our scheduling, but definitely keep an eye out for that because it'll be an awesome time. But without further ado, let's get into this. So with haunted forests, now there's a plethora of them around the world, existing in national parks and everywhere. Every country has their staples. Now, I just thought that looking into some of these places, hey, there's something going on here. There's some mystery. I did find one thing particularly intriguing, however, reading an article. Now, when people go missing in the woods and such, people often attribute it to being something paranormal or scary or something very frightful, and that is attributed to the component that humankind has just made the natural world a fearful thing, that we are so foreign to it now that it scares us because we just don't know that unknown factor, and we associate that with something that is maybe more or less paranormal, alien in nature, when in fact it could be just someone just as simply going missing. Now, I'm not saying that's definitely the case, but I appreciated the input and the perspective that was taken on that. Now, when we look at these places, the history that is connected with them, I feel adds a little more credibility to the component of paranormal activity, because you have such a history of negativity and horrendous things that occur in some of these places. And to me, negative actions and activity and paranormal activity seem to jive and go hand in hand. I don't want to say that human suffering always steers that way, but it tends to be more often than not than a positive perspective, I guess you could say. What I mean is, when someone dies from peace, they're not still lingering around in an abandoned shack from dying peacefully. More often than not, it's because maybe they were murdered in the shack or something horrible along those lines occurred to them. But I digress. So our first location, the Witchwood Forest in England. Now, this area is a 501.7 hectare biological site, and this is north of Whitney in Oxfordshire. And in past centuries, the forest covered a much larger area, but due to agriculture, villages, and towns, the forest area has actually fluctuated. We can look back at where parts were cleared for agriculture during the Roman rule. They have since reverted back to forests, so it's had a very dynamic lifespan. Now, outside of that, however, paranormal folks have labeled Witchwood Forest as, and I quote, the world's most haunted forest. And not for a lack of reason either. Legends of hauntings focused in the woods have existed for centuries, followed by inhabiting goblins, witches, and demons. Tourists have actually felt what they claim to be disembodied hands upon their shoulders and witnessed horse-drawn carts carrying shades of crying children. And that's a reoccurring thing, even without the carts. Just the children that appear to be sobbing and crying are often spotted frequently. The most famous spirit, however, residing in Witchwood is called Amy Robert. And this individual was the wife of Earl of Leicester. I apologize if I'm not saying that correctly. It's just one of those scenarios again with my words. Earl of Leicester. And in 1560, she was actually found dead of a broken neck at home in Cumnor Place. No, it was deduced that she had fell down a set of stairs. Rumors persisted, however, that it was her husband who murdered her. This legend, however, continues, with it being that her ghost had later visited the Earl in Witchwood, claiming he had 10 days left before dying. And so the folklore tale continues, where since then, to see Amy means your own death draws close. But this isn't the only proclaimed world's most haunted forest. This is a name, I apologize if I'm getting this one wrong as well. The Hoya Baciu. Hoia-Baciu Forest of Romania. Romania now, this forest joins the list as another truly frightening place. And we all know Romania is definitely a key component to storytelling of vampires, werewolves, and that sort of stuff. So, moving on though. This forest, however, has had a dense reputation of paranormal activity for decades. Strange sightings include ghosts, apparitions, faces actually displayed in photographs that weren't visible with the naked eye. And back in the 1970s, UFO sighting. This forest is also notorious for those mysterious balls of light. And there's even on occasion female voices that are sometimes heard as a form of giggling, with some cases of people actually being scratched. Many tourists to this forest actually report strong feelings of anxiety and a sense of being watched. Some locals to the area claim physical harm has actually been dealt to them upon venturing deep into the forest. This harm can include rashes, nausea, vomiting, migraines, burns, scratches, and large amounts of anxiety. As I mentioned on previous episodes, missing time is also a prominent component of venturing into this forest. And one of the more fascinating scientific aspects to this forest is the magnetic anomalies it actually holds. It fluctuates the electromagnetic field, and it even emits infrasound. One person who really began investigating this forest scientifically was a biologist named Alexandru Sift. And he was drawn there by all the stories he would hear from the local residents, until finally deciding to go and see what all the fuss was himself. It was in the 50s where he made a bunch of trips himself into the forest, capturing many photographs. And one thing he noted was that throughout these trips into the forest, he could see strange shadows in the trees, which he claimed to be actually following him. And that aside, he didn't quit. When he actually examined his photos, he found the shapes were not where they were supposed to be, and that the pictures on the camera were not even in the same order as how he had photographed. So there's obviously some major play here. And when we move into 1968, that's when the UFO appeared. A military technician named Emil Barnia was out actually camping in the woods with friends, and they had witnessed the sighting. When collecting wood, his friends were calling out to him, so naturally he went to see what was up, and without warning saw a UFO flying close to the ground. There was even a perfect circle with no trees and little to no vegetation found in this part of the forest, which was credited with being the landing spot for the UFO. Now moving on here, jumping over to Australia, there's an old facility called the Airedale Lunatic Asylum. I'm going to get into that right after this quick ad break. And we're back. So, having been in commission for over 126 years, the Airedale Lunatic Asylum was an Australian psychiatric hospital located in Ararat, a rural city in Victoria, Australia. The facility was constructed along with two others to accommodate the growing number of mentally ill individuals in the colony of Victoria. And construction started back in 1865, and this was to convert what was a former county jail into this new facility. And so they began accepting patients in 1867. It finally closed its doors in 1993, but at one point it was housing up to 1,000 patients and supported almost 500 staff. This complex had about 70 buildings on its property, but over this length of time, the staff were reported to administer less than pleasing procedures in the patients, and this resulted, or at least contributed to having over 13,000 recorded deaths at this facility, and some staff are included in that as well, not limited to just patients. Nowadays, you can actually book a ghost tour at this facility, but some reports do come in of fainting, unexpected waves of nausea, physical pain while walking around throughout certain rooms. Some of the more terrifying occurrences include being shoved and actually bitten while people are exploring the facility's halls. Shrieking sounds are also a reoccurring thing, along with consistent electrical interference of cameras and other equipment. Seems to be kind of the MO of many of these places. Specifically the ward. It's reported to be haunted by 3 former prisoners that were hung and buried in the exercise area of the ward back in 1859 when the facility was still a county jail. Because they were convicted of murder, they were not given a religious burial, and now it's said that the only memory of their existence are scratch marks into the prison wall. Prisoners aside, though, many people claim to see old facility staff members frequenting in the building, specifically the superintendent's office. Now, it's reported that he died by suicide after swallowing a hydrogen cyanide pill, and I actually found an old newspaper clipping that details the suicide of a doctor at the asylum. It basically explains the gentleman's history and the events that lead up to this point of death, and he had passed at the age of 51. Now, I know before you tear me apart for throwing in an asylum in there when I said all forests, I couldn't help it. As I was looking through and trying to find so many different locations and just getting into it, this one just really stood out to me because of the similarities, and I wanted to compare that and use it as an example where all these forests are having, again, similar occurrences, but then you have something that is completely left field, a different area, different setup, everything. And yet we're getting similar occurrences. And not just with the sightings, but the way that people are physically attacked or approached. And again, with the technology and how the cameras and the gear and the equipment seems to kind of splice in and out like it does in these forest spots. But I digress. Just wanted to share my method of my madness there before people start to freak too much out. But we're going back into a forest here, bringing it across the pond to North America. We have another area of haunted woods that holds itself as being a truly haunted place. It's a small remote forest located in Virginia. It's called the Old House Woods. It's labeled as a mysterious and cursed forest, and stories of the occurrences that take place here date back to as early as the 1700s, around the time of the Revolutionary War. Many pirates and soldiers used to take refuge in the forest back in the day, even into the Civil War era. One of the more spookier reports from a multitude of witnesses is that of a strange skeleton, not just one, but multiple, dressed in armor, wandering the woods. One person reported in 1929 that he was actually approached by strangers carrying lanterns that gave off a mysterious glow. And once they got closer, he could tell they were actually skeletons wearing old-fashioned armor, even waving an old sword around at him. In another instance, a man's car unfortunately broke down on the road that runs straight through the woods, where all of a sudden he was approached by what he described as a skeleton in armor. Now, many supernatural investigators have visited this forest. They often experience a multitude of technical complications, but it doesn't stop them from gathering odd recordings and inexplainable photographs and such still nonetheless. Another note of interest to this forest is that there's an old abandoned house called the Franny Night House. It was located in the middle of the forest. And even back in the 1700s, this home was labeled as haunted due to the fact that it reportedly would just burst into flames only to put itself out and then burn itself up again. This home eventually caught fire for real and it burned to the ground for good. Now, let's jump into an even smaller area called Randolph Forest. Backed by residential houses, the locals have not stopped supporting the haunting components attached to this forest. A few vehicles and debris that has been left behind have been consumed by the overgrowth, to the point where nowadays people are actually seeing orbs of light and hearing strange noises. During the daytime, though, the woods seem perfectly normal. It's when nighttime starts to roll around that things begin to get unsettling. And this forest land runs through the state of Maine, and it's filled with tons of walking trails. There's actually one famous bike trail that's called the Old Narrow Gouge Volunteer Trail, a bike path created over the route of a former railroad that used to help transport injured and sick veterans to the nearby hospital throughout the 18th to 19th century. However, since the bike path's construction, the trail has, you guessed it, become a prominent ghost hotspot. One of the more unsettling aspects to this area is the small wooded area that stems slightly off the bike path. Many people report that this area used to be a prominent spot for ritualistic practices and is now constantly cloaked in darkness, no matter how much actual light exists around it. And last but not least, our final haunted forest of the episode is the Freetown Fall River State Forest, Massachusetts. This piece of land stems for over 200 square miles and is located in the southeastern part of the state, and it has no shortage of paranormal ongoings. The site specifically is the location of many murders throughout history. In November 1978, the remains of a woman named Mary Lou Arruda was discovered tied up to a tree within the woods. She was only 15 years old, unfortunately, and was abducted from the nearby town of Rainham 2 months before. Her murderer was found and convicted. In 1980, police officers were looking into another murder that occurred near the forest. When residents reported to the police that they had witnessed cult activities, people speculated that this was connected to the Fall River murders, which in itself was a series of 3 homicides that actually took place in Fall River, Massachusetts. This was from October 1979 to February 1980, and it was again allegedly by a satanic cult. Police did find weird clearings stained with animal blood and even some carcasses of cattle, but nothing that they could really run with. Murders didn't stop, however. In 1987, a homeless man was mistaken as being an undercover cop and was killed in the forest. In 2001, 2 more bodies were found, peppered from bullets and left on a path that winds through the woods. While this is a more real, unfortunate series of occurrences, murders definitely have a hand in the supernatural, in my personal opinion. And it just kind of touched upon what I mentioned prior, that negative energy that shares a lot of pain and hate that just manifests into what we would perceive today as a paranormal experience. And on that note of the supernatural, UFOs, ghosts, floating orbs of light, strange disappearances, poltergeists, these have all been things that are attributed to this area. Even black helicopters have been reported, which is a very, very peculiar thing. Me and Ruben did a discussion into the Men in Black, and black helicopters often to be something associated with a Bigfoot or a dogman. But to have it around this forest, I mean, maybe in regards to murders or finding criminals, that would probably be the more logical perspective, I guess. But I digress. There's more than 50 miles of unpaved roads and paths that actually flow throughout this forest, which leaves plenty of space for things to hide, and certainly not a place where you want to wander off the path of. But that's all I got for forests today, and I hope you enjoyed it. I thought, again, I'm just going to reiterate the importance of connecting forests with technology going haywire and the negative aspects, people, the spirits, and then just going sideways and think, okay, let's get a asylum. Let's pull this interesting location and just seeing, okay, we have similarities, and the similarities are what I like to go for. And again, my own perspective, but this is something that me and Ruben have tried to do with Bigfoot even, and Dogman. You can look at other species and see what similarities exist, and maybe even a mental mannerisms, not just physical. But when we did our episode, The Bigfoot Bodies, I like to look at how other animals on this planet look into dealing with their dead, and how we could apply that to a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch. And in this case, I just think it's again fascinating how we can examine one area and how that applies to a wooded, forested area. Where does the boundary end if you're in a forest, unlike you are in a building? It just seems like a forest could span for, what, 50 miles? That seems like a lot of turf to cover that's all haunted. Now, granted, there are locations within forests that are much more prominent. There's a few actually where I read like the Devil's walking ground, I believe, or tramping ground, an area where nothing would grow. People tried putting seeds in there, nothing would happen. So people just assume that there is a supernatural component attached to it. It was just this dead spot in one of these forests. But I definitely suggest look into it. There's lists and lists and lists of places out there that are all full of hauntings, and it's truly terrifying. The woods are scary enough as it is, but when you go out there and you happen upon a haunted part of the woods, then my prayers are with you. Hopefully you don't get stuck out there. But without further ado, that is it for this episode, everyone. You can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca. You can find us on our social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. And you can send us an email, CryptidClues@gmail.com. So until next time, everyone, stay safe and take care. Thank you.